I never believed in fate's signs until I received a letter that changed my life. It was just 3 lines. You don't know the whole truth. Don't believe what you see. There was no signature. I reread these words over and over until the cold from the paper seeped into my fingers. In the dim light of the lamp, it seemed to me that the ink was trembling, as if reflecting my own anxiety. The mansion where I was brought smelled of something old, rotten, almost frozen in time. I entered and felt the walls pressing against me. This was the house of my late husband, left to me after his sudden and mysterious death. A voice sounded behind me. Marlene, you'd better not scatter your things. They don't like disorder here. I shuddered. Frank, my father-in-law, stood in the doorway, motionless as a stone statue. His face was devoid of emotions, but there was something dark, barely perceptible in his eyes. You are now the mistress of this house. Get used to it. I nodded, although inside everything was tightening with fear. When the door closed behind him, I finally exhaled. This house was not my home. I felt something alien in it. That evening, I decided to unpack my things. As I walked around the house, it seemed to me that shadows were sliding along the corridors. Every step echoed hollowly in the high walls. In every corner, in every old painting, there was a sense of being watched. I opened my suitcase, but among my things, I found something alien. At the very bottom lay an old diary, tattered with pages faded by time. The name on the cover squeezed my chest with a steel ring. It was my husband's diary. I slowly sat down on the edge of the bed, my fingers trembling as I turned the first page. If you are reading this, it means I am already dead. I abruptly closed the book. My heart was pounding wildly. I looked around. The silence thickened like a dense fog, but I had to know the truth. I opened the diary again. Don't believe what your father tells you. If I die, it's not an accident. Someone wants to hide the truth. I heard the floor creak behind me. Someone was standing in the darkness watching me. I froze, afraid to turn around. My breathing quickened. My palms were sweating. What are you reading there? Frank's voice sounded. Slowly, as if in a dream, I closed the diary and looked up. Frank stood in the doorway, his eyes icy. Just old notes, I lied, feeling the adrenaline pierce my blood. Better not to stir up the past, Marlene. His voice was low, filled with threat. In this house, the past has a nasty habit of coming back. I wanted to say something, but the words stuck in my throat. He stood for another moment, studying me, then nodded and left. I didn't breathe until the sound of his footsteps faded, but I already knew something terrible was hiding in this house, and if I didn't find out the truth, I would be the next to die. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, it seemed to me that someone was standing at the bedroom door, in the darkness, watching me. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks, but the air in this house was thick as tar, and I felt a strange presence. I lay motionless, listening to the silence. But what scared me the most, this house was not empty. I heard soft footsteps. Somewhere deep in the corridors, the old wood creaked as if under someone else's feet. In the morning, when I finally fell asleep, I was awakened by a sound that could not be mistaken for anything. The paper rustled behind the door like dry leaves under boots. I abruptly opened my eyes. On the threshold of the bedroom lay an envelope. Black, no name, no seal. I froze. It seemed to me that someone was behind the door. I slowly got up from the bed, approached, examined the gap below. No one. But when I opened the door, the corridor was empty, only dark emptiness ahead. I bent down and picked up the letter with trembling fingers. I tore open the edge, pulled out a folded sheet. You need to leave. Soon it will be too late. I felt a cold sweat run down my spine. Someone wanted to warn me. But from what? I couldn't just sit and wait. I had to figure it out. After breakfast, when Frank went to his office, I began to explore the house. This mansion was too big, too old. Every corridor, every turn hid something strange. Dusty cabinets, locked doors, paintings with worn-out eyes that looked the wrong way. I entered the living room. There was an old fireplace, massive stone. Next to it, a shelf with books. Something was wrong with it. I approached closer. One of the books was missing, a hole in the very center of the shelf. I reached out, ran my fingers over the wood. Click. And suddenly the shelf slowly slid aside, revealing a hidden passage. I held my breath. Before me was a dark tunnel leading into the depths of the house. I turned on the flashlight on my phone and went inside. The air was stale, smelling of dampness and dust. The tunnel was narrow with walls of raw brick. I took a few steps and suddenly noticed. On the floor lay someone's old shoe covered in dust, as if the owner had long disappeared. And then, on the wall, a red mark, like the imprint of someone's hand. I touched it with a trembling hand, and suddenly I heard footsteps behind me. Someone was in the tunnel. I froze, my heart pounding in my throat, and then someone's shadow flashed at the end of the corridor. I didn't know who it was, but I knew one thing for sure. I was not alone here. I was petrified. The darkness in the tunnel thickened, turning the walls into eerie figures that seemed to be watching me. Behind me, footsteps. Someone else's, unhurried but purposeful. Someone was following me. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding loudly in my ears, but I forced myself to stay still, to listen. Who was there? Silence. The footsteps were gone, but I knew someone was there. I took another step forward, deeper into the tunnel. The walls became wider, and soon I found myself in a small stone room. On the floor were strange traces. Something dark, almost dried, stretched to the center of the room. Blood? I leaned down. I ran my fingers over the floor. Yes, it was blood. Fresh. I abruptly straightened up, my heart pounding wildly. One thought flashed through my mind. Someone had been here recently. I took a few cautious steps, listening to the sounds, and suddenly I noticed him, a figure in the corner of the room, black, motionless. Someone was sitting in the shadows. I let out a muffled scream, backing away, but the body in the corner did not move. A man. He was wearing a tattered jacket, his head lifelessly tilted to the side. I saw his face. His eyes were open, but he was no longer breathing. He was dead. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened. Who was he? How did he end up here? And most importantly, who killed him? Next to his body lay something metallic, a weapon, a rusty but still sturdy shovel. There was blood on the blade. I rushed around the room, my brain unable to process what was happening, and suddenly something creaked behind me. I was not alone. Someone stepped out of the shadows. I slowly turned around. In the dim light of the tunnel, a silhouette appeared. Frank. He stood in the passage holding bloody gloves in his hands. His eyes were cold, empty, but he did not look scared. On the contrary, he looked at me like a problem. You shouldn't have come in here, Lily. His voice was calm, too calm, as if he had already anticipated all this. I stepped back, but bumped into the body. Frank, who is this? My voice trembled. Someone who knew too much. I froze. My heart raced in a wild rhythm. I realized with incredible clarity that if I stayed here, I would be next. Frank slowly stepped forward. I took a step back. Another one. But he was in no hurry. He was enjoying this moment, as if he knew I couldn't escape. But I wasn't going to give up. I suddenly spun around, grabbed an old lamp from the wall and threw it at him. The lamp shattered, the room filled with harsh light. I saw his evil grin before I rushed to run. I heard his footsteps behind me. I ran through the tunnel, barely touching the floor with my feet. He was catching up to me. I knew that if he grabbed me right now, it would all be over. But at the last moment, I rushed out of the tunnel, hitting the shelf with my shoulder. The shelf slammed shut, blocking the entrance. I heard him crash into the door from the other side. A dull thud. Pause. Silence. I jumped back, my hands trembling. Frank was left there. But for how long? I had to act quickly. I stood in the darkness, trying to calm my breathing. The tunnel was closed, but I knew it wouldn't last long. Frank was on the other side, and he wouldn't stop. I had to act quickly. The light of the lamp on the wall flickered, casting eerie shadows. I needed to leave, but where? Forward, another tunnel, narrow and oppressive. Back into the house, but Frank was there. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was clear. I couldn't stay still. I rushed forward deeper into the dark corridor. Somewhere behind me, a dull thud sounded. Frank was trying to open the door. My heart tightened. I heard him grumbling, kicking the wall. And suddenly, a crash. Something collapsed. The shelf couldn't hold. Frank was free. I bit my lip, holding back a scream. My heart was pounding wildly. He was coming after me. I felt it. I ran with all my might, but the tunnel became narrower and narrower. My breath caught. My lungs burned. I reached a fork. 2 doors. Which one led outside? I grabbed the left handle. Pulled. Locked. Damn. Frank was close. I rushed to the second door. It opened with a hollow creak. Inside it was even darker. But there was no choice. I burst inside and slammed the door behind me. Deathly silence. I cautiously looked around. The room was small, the walls made of brick. On the floor, dust, old furniture in the corner, the smell of dampness and something else. I felt a lump in my throat. Something was lying on the table. Documents. I quickly scanned the yellowed pages with my eyes. Photographs. Frank. And other people I didn't know. Frank was not who he claimed to be. This was not the first murder, not the first disappearance. I trembled looking at his face in the photos. He was always near the victims, but no one suspected him. I felt the air thicken. Footsteps. Behind the door. Frank was nearby. He stopped right behind the wall. I held my breath. The handle slowly turned. I rushed into the corner, hid behind the cabinet. The door opened with a dull thud. Frank entered. I saw his silhouette, his shadow trembling in the light of the lamp. He walked around the room, his breathing heavy. "Lily," he spoke almost tenderly. "I know you're here." My body froze. I knew if he found me, it was the end. He took a step forward, then another. My heart was beating so loudly that it seemed he could hear it. He stopped right in front of the cabinet, reached out his hand, but suddenly, a crash outside. Someone entered the tunnel. Frank jerked his head up. His face changed. He turned around and rushed out of the room. I was left alone, but not for long. Who else had come to this house? I didn't move, afraid to make a sound. The tunnel was filled with rustling, someone's footsteps, heavy, not hurried. Frank? Number. He was not in the room. I peeked through the gap between the cabinet and the wall, a shadow by the door. Someone else was here. Someone was looking for me. A voice, low, familiar. "Frank?" I almost screamed in surprise. That voice. It was Kyle, a policeman, my childhood friend. But what was he doing here? Frank fell silent. I heard him breathing in the tunnel. He was just a few steps away from Kyle. I had to do something. Kyle walked on, keeping his hand on his holster. "Frank, come out!" Silence. Only silence, which burned the nerves. I knew Frank had already thought of something. He was not one to give up, and I was not mistaken. I heard a sigh, and then a soft metallic click. A knife. Frank was armed. My heart was pounding wildly. I had to do something. But if I made a sound, it all happened in seconds. Kyle stepped forward. Frank lunged out from behind the corner. I saw the flash of the knife. Kyle screamed. Frank plunged the knife into his side. I gasped, covering my mouth with my hand. Kyle staggered. His gun flew out of his hands. Frank struck him again. Kyle fell to his knees. A bloody stain spread on his shirt. I saw his eyes glaze over. He tried to say something, but Frank leaned down and whispered, "No one will hear you, buddy," and raised the knife again. I couldn't stay silent anymore. I rushed out of my hiding place, grabbed the gun from the floor. Frank turned around. I didn't think. I just pulled the trigger. A shot, a crash. Frank staggered back, clutching his chest. His eyes widened. He gasped and collapsed. I stood, breathing heavily. The gun fell from my hands. Frank did not move. His chest stopped rising. I killed him. I saved Kyle. But this was still not the end. Kyle groaned, trying to get up. I rushed to him, pressing on his wound. He needed to get out of here. But then I heard a new sound, Someone else was descending into the tunnel. Someone else knew we were here, and that someone was coming after us. I sensed their footsteps even before I saw them. Hollow, measured, confident. A flashlight darted across the tunnel walls. Someone's silhouette loomed in the darkness. I gasped for air, trying to stop the trembling in my hands. Kyle was breathing convulsively on my shoulder. His wound was bleeding, and I didn't know how much time we had. But I knew something else. We were not alone, and someone was coming after us. I tensed. The tunnel was too narrow. Nowhere to run. Nowhere to hide. Kyle stirred, barely audibly moaning. Lily? Who is it? I slowly turned around. The flashlight illuminated a face. My heart stopped. It was him. Dad? I exhaled that word, but it sounded like an accusation. He stood before us, holding an old revolver in his hand. His face was the same as I remembered it. Only now it was harder. His eyes were cold, a slight smile that scared me more than the gun itself. Baby girl, he said, shaking his head. You made a big mistake. I clenched my fists. Somewhere inside I had always known that he was connected to all of this. Frank couldn't have acted alone. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to. You knew? I whispered. He smirked. Of course! My stomach tightened. He knew. He helped Frank. He guided him. You were in on it with him? Oh, Lily. He shook his head. You're so naive. You killed Mom? He froze, and then quietly laughed. Why are you asking if you know the answer? Everything turned upside down. I understood everything at once. You were never supposed to get involved in this, he said, approaching. Kyle twitched beside me. I felt his body weakening. We couldn't fight. We had to run. I looked around. The tunnel branched out. 2 paths, one led outside, the other into the darkness, from which there was no return. I had to choose. He raised the gun. Goodbye, baby girl. A shot. I didn't feel the pain, not right away. But someone fell to the ground. Not me, not Kyle. I opened my eyes. Dad lay on his back. The gun had fallen from his hand. Kyle was trembling, holding his own gun. I didn't even know he had one. He looked at me. Are you okay? I nodded, though I knew it wasn't true. I dragged Kyle through the tunnel. Behind us lay the body of my father. I didn't look back. I knew that if I looked back, everything would collapse. We emerged outside. The cold air cut through the skin. The sky was dark, but I knew that morning would come soon. Kyle gasped, sinking to the ground. I fell beside him, closing my eyes. We were alive, but the story was not over.